Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 702 for May 31st, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
Being a bourbon badass is really knowing what you like, why you like it, and drinking it the way you want it, and not having somebody else tell you you absolutely have to drink it neat. That's blasphemy if you don't. And I know there are people out there that would not agree with me on that. But in my mind, if they're drinking it and they like it, then more power to them.
Linda Ruffenach coined the term Bourbon Badass. She's the founder of the Whisky Chicks and the author of the new book, How to Be a Bourbon Badass. And by the way, badass is gender neutral. My conversation with Linda Ruffenach is coming up later on WhiskyCast In-Depth, along with your voice, the calendar of events, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and Behind the Label, all on this edition of WhiskyCast.
This is Whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. And it looks like the trade war is on. U.S. President Donald Trump announced today that punitive tariffs will take effect at midnight on steel and aluminum imported from the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. That follows a one-month delay while the U.S. tried to negotiate lower export quotas from its trading partners in exchange for an exemption from the tariffs. European Union leaders in Brussels immediately confirmed plans to start their process for imposing retaliatory tariffs on key American exports, including a 25% tariff on bourbon and other American whiskeys. Those tariffs could take effect by the end of June. The European Union nations make up the largest single exporter of steel and aluminum to the U.S. Earlier this week, the Irish Whiskey Association's William Lavelle told his members that any retaliation by the U.S. that targets Irish and other European whiskey exports could devastate the Irish whiskey industry. We'll have more on this story on our weekend edition of WhiskyCast. Last month, we reported on Ben Romach's 20th anniversary since it was reopened under Gordon and MacPhail's ownership. Now, the Urquhart family is planning to build a second distillery in Speyside, specifically at Cragan near Grantown-on-Spey in the Cairngorms National Park. Their Spey Malt Whiskey Distributors Limited holding company will start a consultation process with the local community before submitting an application for planning approval to the Highlands Council later this year. Assuming that's approved, construction would not begin until next year at the earliest. No name has been decided for the new distillery yet. And before anyone starts questioning whether it's appropriate to build a distillery inside a national park, let's remember that Cairngorms National Park is the largest in the UK and spans almost 1,800 square miles from Blair Athol on the south near Pitlochry to Grantown-on-Spey at the north. While this would be the first new distillery built inside the park since it was created in 2003, there are at least half a dozen existing distilleries inside the park now, including the Glenlivet, Tomintoul, Royal Lochnagar, Dalwhinnie, and Blair Athol. Gordon and MacPhail executives were not available for an interview in time for this episode. Brown-Forman CEO Paul Varga has announced his plans to retire at the end of the year after 13 years leading the company. He'll be succeeded by Lawson Whiting, a 21-year Brown-Forman veteran, who's currently Varga's number 2 executive as Chief Operating Officer. He took on that role last year and has been responsible for expanding Brown-Forman's whiskey portfolio with the acquisition of the Benriach Company's distilleries in Scotland and the development of Slane Irish whiskey. Meanwhile, Douglas Lang and Company has officially confirmed a leadership change that Fred Lang disclosed to us several weeks ago. Fred has stepped aside from day-to-day management of the Glasgow-based company, but will remain as chairman. Chris Leggett moves up from his role as the company's commercial director to serve as CEO. And Sazerac plans to expand its operations across the Ohio River into southern Indiana. It's working on a deal to buy the former Pillsbury plant in New Albany, Indiana, to be turned into a blending, bottling, and distribution center. The project is expected to cost around $66 million, but faces a final vote next week on incentives from New Albany's City Council before work begins. Turning now to new whiskeys. Last week, the Macallan's Ken Greer politely demurred to share specifics of one of the new whiskeys that's being released around the opening of the Macallan's new distillery in Speyside, other than to say that it would be the oldest Macallan ever bottled. We now know more details on that whiskey. It's a 72-year-old Macallan single malt that will be the second oldest single malt ever bottled. The only one older than that is Gordon & MacPhail's 2015 bottling of a 75-year-old Mortlach single cask. The Macallan will, as one might expect, come in a bespoke Lalique decanter. Only 600 of those decanters will be available starting this August at selected retailers around the world, along with the distillery's shop in Speyside. The list price? Around $60,000 a bottle. Woodford Reserve has used some of its annual Masters Collection whiskeys to test out ideas that sometimes find their way into permanent additions to the range. And that's the case with the newest Woodford Reserve expression. Woodford Reserve Straight Malt is made with 51% malted barley, and it's a follow-up to the two 2013 Masters Collection malt whiskeys. Master distiller Chris Morris also calls it a throwback to the early days of Kentucky whiskey.
Most people don't realize, unless you're a real student of the industry, how pervasive different types of whiskey making were in the United States, certainly here in Kentucky, prior to Prohibition. Long before the rules that exist today were in place, our ancestors were making all sorts of different kinds of whiskeys. Yes, bourbon, or is what we would call bourbon today, and rye whiskeys were prominent and predominant, but they were making other things. And I thought it was so interesting that coming out of Prohibition, the federal government specifically allowed for Kentucky straight bourbon. Well, I say Kentucky, of course, I look at everything through the Kentucky lens, but straight bourbon, straight rye, straight wheat, and straight malt whiskeys. And we're bringing those back to life.
Now, when you did the Masters Collection malts a couple of years ago, those were 100% malt.
Yes.
This is only 51% from what I understand. Why'd you change it a bit?
Well, again, a lot has changed since we were pioneering malt whiskey in Kentucky many years ago, or the return to malt whiskey. And I just thought moving forward that the 100% malts were not all that exciting. I mean, they were nice whiskeys, but because we don't have the influence of peat as you would find in some European whiskeys and even some American whiskeys today, and we were not using various barrel types in our inventory, such as a little bit of porter, a little bit of sherry, that these 100%, or let's call them single malt just for clarification, whiskeys were a bit bland, a bit boring in some regards. And also, they weren't historic. And that's why we have returned to a classic Kentucky-style malt whiskey that includes corn, because that's what our ancestors like to use in Kentucky. Lots of corn. We have a little bit of rye, and, of course, malt. And in our experimentations, Mark, obviously with 100% malt as an extreme, you can only go down, can't go below 51% and still be a malt whiskey. And we tried various ratios, 60% malt, 65% malt. And it turns out that malt, especially distiller's malt as we use, is such a nice soft grain that swings from 51 to 55 to 60 to 65 don't have a real marginal flavor impact. In fact, you're reducing the corn and you're reducing the rye, so that is a negative flavor impact for what we were looking for. So we went with the minimum allowable amount of malt because it didn't have a flavor profile impact that was positive. We wanted to still have that corn and rye note come through. So that was a decision based on flavor.
Woodford Reserve Straight Malt is bottled at 45.2% ABV and will sell for around $35 a bottle. I received a sample of it this week, and I'll have tasting notes for it soon at whiskeycast.com. Meanwhile, Wyoming Whiskey is coming out with a new bourbon that's an homage to one of that state's traditions. If you've ever seen the Wyoming license plate with a bucking horse and cowboy, well, the horse in that image was real, and its name was Steamboat. Wyoming Whiskey's Steamboat Edition will only be available in the state of Wyoming. Managing Director David DeFazio calls it a follow-up to last year's Eclipse Edition, but it's also more than that.
We wanted to target the Wyoming market exclusively with this product, and the one thing that we know about Wyoming whiskey drinkers is they definitely like a lighter, easier drinking whiskey. And so what we did is design a batch out of the lower ricks of our warehouses that is going to appeal as much as we can to those folks that like a lighter whiskey.
With still having all the same flavor and character that your standard straight bourbon has.
Of course. It's really hard for us to deviate too far from what our standard flavor profiles are. And one of the few ways that we can do that is by selecting barrels from specific areas of the warehouse that are going to come in either on the lighter side, the spicier side, just depending on what level we're picking it from.
And you've also got a new barrel strength coming out too, right?
We do. Sam found that last year, and Nancy verified that it is as good as he had expected and thought it was. And we have 55 bottles available in about a month and a half. We're just putting the final touches on some packaging, and my goal would be to have that readily available. Actually, readily is probably a misleading term, but available to a few select markets sometime towards the end of June.
No word yet on pricing for the Wyoming Whiskey barrel strength or which markets it'll be available in. We'll keep you posted. And finally, if you're a Marvel Comics or movies fan, you know that Thor's hammer Mjolnir can only be wielded by those who are worthy. Well, some very clearly unworthy people made off with the hammer at Mjolnir, Melbourne in Australia last Saturday night. Yes, it's a Thor-themed bar, and try to say that 3 times real fast. This, though, was not your typical hammer. It was an exact replica of the hammer from Marvel's Thor movies and was commissioned by the Balvenie specially for the bar. It was also a whiskey decanter, too, one of only 2 created by a weapons maker for the Lord of the Rings movies. The bar's staff posted on Facebook that 2 men came into the bar that night, then came back a bit later with 3 more friends, and actually told a staff member, "We came back for the hammer." They were spotted on security cameras walking off with the hammer wrapped up in plastic, and the bar posted their photos on its Facebook page. There is a happy ending to the saga, though. The hammer was dumped at Melbourne's airport and is being returned to the bar. Apparently, you can't take Thor's hammer or a whiskey decanter on an airplane. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskeycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking soul. If you see the light, follow it, especially if it's Highland Park's The Light. 17 years old and matured in refill American oak casks for a clean, perhaps even light taste. It's the counterpart to the Dark Edition released this past winter. You can get all the details at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The New York Whiskey Jubilee is this coming Thursday night, June 7th, followed the next night by the Whisky X in Brooklyn. Buffalo Trace Distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky hosts Pappy for Your Pappy Father's Day weekend on June 15th. The Edinburgh Whiskey Festival is on June 16th in Edinburgh, Scotland, and the Whiskey Bells host their latest charity whiskey tasting and silent auction on the 16th at Happy Harbor Comics in Edmonton, Alberta. Whiskey Live Durban is June 21st through the 23rd in Durban, South Africa. Whiskey Freedom 2018 is June 23rd in Perth, Australia. And the Erin Malt and Music Festival runs from June 29th through July 1st in Lacranza, Scotland. Right now we have 314 different events on the searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. There's bound to be at least one near you.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. You know all those stories about how more women are getting into whiskey these days? Well, give groups like Women Who Whiskey and the Whisky Chicks a lot of the credit. Linda Ruffenach founded the Whisky Chicks 4 years ago in Louisville. She's written the new book, How to Be a Bourbon Badass, and was in New York City for a tasting and book signing with the local Women Who Whiskey chapter Thursday night. Let's start off by defining Bourbon Badass. How do you define the term?
How do I define the term Bourbon Badass? Well, first let me tell you where it came from. Is that I had a friend of mine, her sister came in for a bourbon tasting. We did a tour of one of the distilleries in Kentucky, and she never really had bourbon before. But after that, she kind of fell in love with bourbon and started to, when she'd go out, she'd order it as her preferred cocktail. Well, she actually unfortunately went through a divorce, and she was kind of going out on her first blind date, and she was nervous, of course, but she got to the restaurant or the bar before her date did, and she went up to the bar and she ordered Blanton's, which had become one of her favorite bourbons. And her date showed up and, asked her what she was drinking, and she told him, and he said, wow, that's badass. And so, her confidence level went from where it was, she was nervous, to a much higher level, and therefore was a lot more relaxed on the rest of the day, a lot more confident. And that's kind of been where this journey has kind of led me, is that knowledge and that experience about bourbon really leads to a confidence and a sense of empowerment. Has nothing to do with the alcohol itself. It really has to do with that knowledge and being comfortable and knowing what you like and why you like it, and drinking it the way you like it without having somebody tell you to do it their way.
How did you discover bourbon in the first place? What made you a bourbon badass?
Well, it goes back to a very young age. Which I won't get into that story, but...
Go ahead. The statute of limitations has expired. Go ahead.
Well, it's funny. The family lore is that I had my first bourbon when I was around 3 years old. At every celebration, we always had bourbon cocktails at family celebrations, and my grandparents were known for making these frozen whiskey sours. And the story goes that I spotted the whiskey sour from across the room. My brother watched me do this, where I went over and took the whiskey sour, because I thought it looked really good. It was a frozen drink with, one of those bright red maraschino cherries in it, and I basically downed it. And then apparently I became the entertainment for the evening, watching a 3-year-old kind of walk around drunk. Once again, totally politically incorrect. But like I said, bourbon has always been part of our family stories. I grew up in a Catholic family where when you walked in the door, you were asked, what do you want to eat? What do you want to drink? And you didn't get to relax until you said yes to one or both of those things. And in our house, it was usually beer or it was a highball. And so I'm one of 4 kids, and each one of us were, by the age of 7 or 8, we all knew how to make a highball, because that's what we served guests when they came in. And of course, we weren't allowed to drink it Maybe we took a little, licked the spoon when we were done, but it's just something that's always been around. But for many years, I didn't really drink bourbon. I was a beer and a wine drinker, big red wine drinker. And then my husband, I met, who lived in Philly, actually moved to Louisville, and he decided he was going to embrace all things Kentucky, which included investing in a horse, which I don't recommend. Second thing is he bought a pickup truck. And the third thing was he decided he was going to try bourbon. And the first time he had bourbon, he almost spit it out. He was a gin, red wine drinker, but he downed this bourbon and instantly got the hiccups. And I just assumed that was going to be his last drink of bourbon. But unbeknownst to me, he started really researching it and finding out what was going on. And this is way before the bourbon boom ever hit in Kentucky, or the Renaissance came back. He was out there researching and finding out things. And then, every Christmas he would ask me to go, his one treat at Christmas was a bottle of this bourbon that I had to call maybe 3 liquor stores to find. And then I finally found one that would always set it aside, and that just happened to be Pappy's. And that was, $100 back then. And I thought, well, whatever, we'll start buying that if that's what's going to make him happy. Now, of course, we can't even find it. But he kind of got me back into it, and we started drinking bourbon, and he took me to a Bourbon Society event, and I just realized there was a lot of men in the room, and there weren't a lot of women in the room. And at that event, I really got a chance to sample different things and taste different things, and really started to understand what people were beginning to see in bourbon, is that it can be as complex as a red wine. It's very interesting, and if you take the time to savor it and savor each one, you realize how different each bourbon is and how unique it is. And then even within the brands, how unique each one of them can be, whether it's a barrel pick or it's a, where they're at different proofs or it's small batch, just all different expressions of the same brand and how they can vary greatly, just like red wines do. And so from there, it just kind of got started up again.
And that's when you decided to found the Whisky Chicks, because you didn't see a lot of women like you at these tastings, right?
Well, that's part of it. Really, it came out of, I had left a job that I'd been at for 19 years, and I realized that my whole network was outside of Louisville, because most of my clients are outside of Louisville. And I wanted to meet other women who had nothing to do with my work, my spouse, or kids. And I thought, what better way to do that than over a glass of bourbon? We held our first event. It was on a very cold January night, and I thought I'd be lucky if I had 10 of my friends show up. I mean, it was 6 degrees out. It was like the biggest cold snap in Louisville in quite a while. And we had 35 women show up that night. And from there, I knew, wow, there's a real interest in learning about bourbon. And that's kind of where it all started and where it's taken off from there. Now, 4 years later, we've got about 1,500 registered members. We've got close to 4,000 followers on Facebook. And we're just in Louisville right now, and we're looking to expand in other locations over the upcoming years.
What makes bourbon so attractive, not just to women, but to men, but to everybody?
Well, like I said, the piece that I love about it is the complexities of it, and really understanding that, especially if you're mindful in your tasting and you take time to taste it and taste it different ways, how you can get different experiences from it. For instance, last night, we actually did a cheese pairing with the French Cheese Board in New York. And one of the things that we did is we tasted things like, one of the greatest examples I like to give is the difference between Basil Hayden and Old Grandad. So both of these are bean products. Basil Hayden is what I would call a good starter bourbon, and one that, it's a great sipping bourbon. It's also very mild, very soft, but just a touch of pepper in it. And when you actually take time to experience it and you realize where you feel it on your palate and how long it lingers or how long it doesn't linger, and what a tasting experience that can be. Then last night we actually paired it with a cheese, which I believe that one was kind of not quite a Parmesan, but it was a more aged cheese. And how with that salt and the different components in it, how even taking a bite of that, it actually started bringing out some different flavors in the bourbon itself. And then you compare that to Old Grandad, which actually is the same mash bill. It's at 100 proof. It was the Old Grandad bottled and bond. And you recognize how significant of a difference those two are. Even though they're made from kind of the same recipe, but you get completely different flavors. Old Granddad Bottled Bond is much spicier, much bolder. It lingers a little bit differently on the tongue than the Basil Hayden does. And in that case, we paired it with, and I'm not sure I can't remember exactly what we paired it with, but when we ate it with the cheese, it actually ended up bringing out a sweet flavor that you don't normally taste in an Old Granddad. And it kind of brought it forward in a very unique way. And once again, being a person who has always loved red wine, loved doing food pairings, is a true foodie where I love doing multiple course meals with the pairings and all that kind of stuff. Never really thought about pairing it with bourbon, but now understanding how those different flavors and complexities are there, it's been one of my favorite things to do is trying to discover what goes with what. And there's some things that don't go together, that don't work. But then there's other things that when you pair them, like we did a food and bourbon pairing with the folks from Beam and Maker's Mark. I'm not going to get this right, but it's on our blog, on our website. But I believe it was Knob Creek that we paired it with prosciutto and melon. And what it did to change the flavors of the bourbon was phenomenal. And who would think to pair bourbon with fruit and meat?
Well, you do that occasionally with scotches. I've seen scotches paired with fruits, and I've seen them paired, obviously, with the meats at times. But I'm going to suggest something here that is perhaps going to be a bit controversial and will probably get me banned from Scotland forever. But there's part of me that thinks that bourbon may actually be more complex than a single malt scotch. And I'm saying that because of the variety of grains that go into it and the way those grains interact with the barrel.
It's funny is I've just really started experimenting with Irish whiskeys and Scotch whiskeys. And along with that food pairing we did with Makers and Beam, it was part of a 2-part series where we actually did food pairings with Japanese whiskeys and an Irish whiskey and Scotch whiskeys. I don't know if I would say that bourbon is more complex, but they're different. It is very, very different. So they all bring out different notes and different flavors in each one of them. I've just started experimenting with scotches, but the scotches I've had have been dramatically different. And, whether it's a blend or it's a single malt, but just the different components and flavors and how they blend them together. And it's just completely and totally fascinating to me how all of that works. But the one thing is that I think just like bourbon, it's great. There's obviously different ways to pair it with food. The thing about bourbon is I think you get a touch of sweetness and more of those fruity, caramelly, kind of baking notes a little bit more in them than what you do in some of the scotches. And the scotches you get, from what I've experienced, you're getting a little bit more of that smoke and less of that sweetness coming through. I think, basically because they're using barrels at different ages, but at bourbon, what I believe happens, once again, I'm not an expert on this. This is just based upon tasting a lot of whiskey, is that, you're picking up those sugars in that first maturation in that barrel and picking up the things that come out of the charring. And then when you get to scotch, which is a lot of times is used in a bourbon barrel, you're picking up more of the smokiness and the oakiness of the wood itself and, using the malts versus the corn, not necessarily getting as much sweetness. So I'm not sure I answered your question or said I agreed or disagreed. I think they're all just different. And the one thing that I encourage people to do is just truly experiment with it, especially for those that, might be a little intimidated by it. It's okay to try it and try different things, because the one thing that I keep reminding people of is everyone's palate is very different. Just like some people like something spicy, some people like something sweet. There's things that, I've got 2 boys and neither one of them like the same thing. And so it's just like them that, one likes pizza, one likes Mexican food. Well, one might like scotch, one may like bourbon. And then even in bourbons, you may like a wheated bourbon, you may like a rye bourbon. But the only way you're going to find out is just truly experimenting and trying them.
And I may be just starting trouble here too. I just was throwing that out there just to see, just to start trouble. But there are.
I love it. I love stirring up trouble.
Yeah, might as well have a little bit of fun here.
Absolutely.
Especially when you talk about everybody having a different palate. It's okay to not like bourbon. It's okay to not like a scotch. It's okay to have a preference. Whatever you like, whatever makes you happy, go for it.
Well, and not only that, but drink it the way you want to drink it. I get really frustrated when, there are people that are incredibly passionate about bourbon and that they believe that bourbon needs to be drank a certain way. And yes, I think to get not the essence, what's the right word I'm looking at? If you want to taste it in its rawest form, then yeah, drink it neat. It's a great way to experience it. But if you're never had bourbon before, or you don't like it neat because that burn is too much for you, which a lot of times is what turns people off of whiskey, is that burn sometimes that you're feeling down the throat, which we lovingly refer to as that Kentucky hug. But if you just put a drop of water in it and just take that experience, to me, that has been one of the most fascinating learning experiences I've had through this journey, is how one single drop of water and a glass of bourbon, how it will dissipate and change the flavor so much to where it will take away, many of the bourbons, it'll take away some of that burn and get to the point where you get to taste the other flavors into the bourbon and not just the heat. But you don't know that unless you experiment. Drink it with water if you want it with water. Drink it with ginger ale. Don't let people tell you how to drink it or how you should like it. And really kind of going back to your first question, that's part about being a bourbon badass, is really knowing what you like, why you like it, and drinking it the way you want it, and not having somebody else tell you you absolutely have to drink it neat. That's blasphemy if you don't. And I know there are people out there that would not agree with me on that. But in my mind, if they're drinking it and they like it, then more power to them.
Absolutely. I have a way that I drink it, but when I'm doing tasting notes, I want it consistent from glass to glass so that I can do a proper comparison. But if I'm just drinking for pleasure, or drinking at the end of the evening and just having a glass, I'll stick an ice cube in there every once in a while, or stick a little bit of water in or something like that, just to break up the routine and just have a little fun with it.
Well, and like when I do tastings, I do it straight. I'll then put a drop of water in it. Then I'll put a cube of ice, because they are three different ways of tasting the whiskey. And sometimes there's a dramatic shift. Sometimes it's a little subtle. Sometimes it's not so good. There's a couple of bourbons where I put water in it and changed the flavor to where it was like, ooh, that's not as good as it was when I tasted it neat. But once again, I like to try it those different ways to see which ones what way is the best way for that particular bourbon. And the interesting part is I've done barrel tastings and gone with some of the master distillers. Many of the master distillers bring a bottle of water along with them. And when they're doing a barrel pull and you're doing a tasting, they'll drink it straight out of the barrel, but then they'll also proof it down and they'll put some water in it and see what other flavors come out as well. So if they're doing it that way, then I guess it's okay if I do it that way.
Absolutely, because they're looking at it. They have to bottle it at 40% at times. So
Yes.
They've got to see what it's going to taste like at 40%, theoretically.
Yes. And then, once again, taking some of that burn away, that to me is, like I said, probably one of the most fascinating things, is that little drop of water. And people don't believe me that it's like, literally, it's one drop of water. Mm-hmm. You don't need a bunch, just one drop and it'll change it.
I am betting that you are not a fan of this trend toward flavored bourbons that were designed for women, supposedly.
Well, the word designed for women, absolutely not. Because you know what? Women, like men, want to drink what they want to drink. Don't tell me what I want. Don't tell me this is specifically made for women. I also think it's offensive to men. Because, the one thing is that a lot of our events, we have 20-25% of our attendees are men that come out. And, some of the men like the sweeter stuff. One of the shirts I have is the whiskey's for me, not him. There's men out there that don't like whiskey, and there's nothing wrong with it. And there's ones out there that like it, like the sweeter version of it. That's okay. And I have nothing against the flavored whiskeys. Some of my favorite cocktails come from the flavored whiskeys. Like during the summer, I don't think there's anything better than Evan Williams peach with lemonade and iced tea. You want it even better? Freeze it in your freezer and scoop it up frozen. It makes a fantastic slushy. But once again, don't market to me as a specific demographic. Just market your product. Tell us the story about your product. Tell us why we should be drinking it, what makes it so different. but don't, especially, I always kind of laugh is that, shrink it, pink it, sweeten it. That's not the way to market to women, because in some ways it takes away the allure of your product. Instead of complementing it, it detracts from it.
Nothing worse than a pink bourbon.
Now, there is a pink label bourbon out there. I forget who makes it, that they do some breast cancer awareness and fundraising off of. That's fine. But no, I would not want to drink a pink bourbon.
Where do the Whisky Chicks go from here? I know you said you're thinking about other chapters. If somebody wants to do a chapter of the Whisky Chicks, how can they get in touch with you?
They can send me an email. They can send me an email at linda@whiskychicks.com, and that's spelled without an E. So it's WHISKY chicks.com, and I'd be more than happy to talk to them about it. The biggest thing is that whoever we bring on as ambassadors, they really have to approach it with the same philosophy. And really, part of our events is making everybody feel welcomed. We literally have members from 21 to 95. It's not a specific demographic. And like I said, we end up with 20-25% of our attendees are men. So our tagline is libation liberators, whiskey educators, friendship facilitators. And so there's a hint of playfulness in what we do, but there's also an education component. And then really at the essence of it is making friendships, and friendships that are based upon individuals, not once again about your careers or your kids or your spouse. It's kind of funny. I'm in New York right now, and I traveled here with one of the Whisky Chicks. And it's just a true example. I've known this person for 4 years, and I just now found out what she did for a living on this trip. And now I'm traveling with her. I didn't know what she did because we never really talked about it, because what we talked about was the experiences that we were sharing together, and getting to know each other really as a person one-on-one. And sometimes that's the coolest part about bourbon and whiskey is sharing it. It's about the shared experience.
Linda Ruffenach is the author of How to Be a Bourbon Badass and founder of the Whisky Chicks. You can find her book through your local bookstore, and we've included a link to the Whisky Chicks website in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. Look for the classic 16-year-old, the Distiller's Edition, and the Throwback Edition 8-year-old Lagavulin at a whiskey shop near you. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I joined Scott and Bart from the Scotch Test Dummies on Sunday afternoon for an online charity tasting, along with Travis Watt from the Edmonton Scotch Club. You may remember our recent interview with Travis about his club's Drams for Fams tasting to benefit the local food bank in Edmonton, and how the club expanded it this year to include other whiskey clubs around North America. Well, the Edmonton Scotch Club raised more than $17,000 in Edmonton alone with their tasting this past Saturday night, and other tastings brought that total to more than $28,000 Canadian. And that includes our live YouTube tasting Sunday. More on that in a few minutes. But Scott and Bart kindly sent me samples of the Springbanks they had picked for our online tasting, including a 20-year-old Springbank single cask distillery bottling just for the North American market. It was distilled in 1997 and bottled last year at 51.6% ABV. The nose has good spices, along with touches of grilled salmon and brine, honey, brown sugar, and just a touch of oak. The taste has those same brine and grilled salmon notes, along with white pepper, allspice, and oak. There's a good balance and complexity as the spices build up slowly, leading into the very long finish complemented nicely by touches of honey and brown sugar. I'm scoring the 20-year-old Springbank 1997 single cask a 92. We also tasted the Hazelburn 13-year-old Oloroso cask from the Springbank family. This one was bottled at 47.1% ABV. The nose is sweet and fruity with Christmas cake, muted spices, toffee, brown sugar. Nothing really out of place here, just a clean, simple aroma. The taste is thick, rich, and spicy with allspice, a hint of cinnamon, Christmas cake, and just a touch of figs in the background, all with good balance and complexity. And the finish is nice and long, with gently fading spices, good fruitiness, and a nice balance. I'm scoring the Hazelburn 13-year-old Oloroso cask a 93. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, where they're making room in the trophy case after the recent San Francisco World Spirits Competition. Best Bourbon, Henry McKenna Single Barrel. Best Small Batch Bourbon, Elijah Craig Small Batch. Just more proof of Heaven Hill's pedigree for making whiskeys with award-winning flavor. Meet the family at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Next up, the Whiskey Fairy came all the way from Orkney to deliver a sample of Highland Park's 17-year-old The Light this week. It's matured in refill American oak casks and bottled at 52.9% ABV. The nose is fruity and floral with touches of green apples and pears, along with a slight hint of smokiness. The taste is tart and citrusy with notes of lemon zest, pineapple, a hint of grapefruit, soft spices, and subtle touches of brown sugar and coconut in the background. The finish is long and fruity with a citrusy tartness, and I'm scoring Highland Park's The Light a 92. Finally, we mentioned Knob Creek's new cask-strength rye whiskey in the news earlier this month. I received a sample the other day. It's 9 years old and bottled at 59.8% ABV. The nose has good spices balanced by sweeter notes of honey, brown sugar, caramel candy, and vanilla. The taste is thick and oily with black pepper, clove, and cinnamon spices, along with honey and caramel to round things out. The finish, long and spicy with just a hint of honey. I'm scoring the Knob Creek Cask Strength Rye a 91. Our tasting notes are presented by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of nearly 2,200 whiskeys from around the world at whiskycast.com.
This is whiskey. Johnny Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these places in that place. These are the people that make it, aging in oak for 12 long years. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes. Bold as it is complex, for every step you take, this is Johnny Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up.
Can I drink this now?
Johnny Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume, imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, presented by Lot 40. The tasting notes last time around seem to have inspired a lot of comments, especially those for the infamous Westland Inferno. Tammy Spencer at Scotch Scones on Instagram posted this note: "Usually, I'm envious of all the great spirits you get to sample, but not today. Your tasting notes for Inferno made me laugh out loud." Quoting now, "Please make it stop. Thanks, WhiskyCast, for taking the fall for us so we don't have to." From Tim Wilson at Bulldog Hobbit on Twitter, "Well, you almost made me spit out my coffee on my drive to work today listening to your review of Inferno." From Greg Butler at Butler B on Twitter, "You are to be commended for drinking that stuff." And Ursula Mueller at URS 16875 tweeted from Sweden, "Love chili pepper sauce, but in combination with spirit, My two worst malt experiences were a whiskey tasting of mothballs and another one tasting of bird poo." I do not even want to know how you came up with that comparison, Ursula. And let's give some credit to the folks at Westland for being good sports about this. Their tweet, the April 1st gift that keeps on giving. For the record, Westland's PR guy, Steve Hawley, told me this in an email. Rest assured, folks here would have taken more offense to a higher score. It really helps to have a sense of humor. And, by the way, despite my glowing reviews for the Inferno, I did not finish my entire sample last week. So, I issued a challenge during Sunday's YouTube live tasting with the Scotch Test Dummies and Travis Watt. If we could raise $500 for the food banks during that tasting, I would do a shot of the George Dickel Tabasco barrel finish whiskey I also reviewed last time around. But if we could raise $1,000, I'd do the Dickel shot and a shot of Inferno. Thanks to everyone who took part on Sunday, we raised $1,600 for local food banks, and I did keep up my part of the deal. You can watch me do both shots on YouTube. After all, it's for a good cause, and there's nothing quite like sharing a laugh or two along with a dram. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com, or track us down on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or Tumblr at WhiskyCast. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our inside look at some of the science, history, and other things that make whiskey unique. During our interview earlier, Linda Ruffenach referred to the Old Granddad Bottled in Bond bourbon. And we've seen a real revival of bottled in bond whiskeys in recent years. Bottled in bond is one of those terms that is unique to American whiskeys, and it comes from one of the key pieces of federal law that shaped today's whiskey industry, the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897. Until that time, there wasn't much oversight of the whiskey industry when it came to quality control. As long as the taxes were paid, the government generally stayed out of the way, and that led to chaos for consumers. While the whiskey coming out of the distilleries was usually pretty good, by the time it reached consumers, it was usually watered down with, well, let's just say it was usually anything but water. What the law did was put the government in charge of guaranteeing the quality of a whiskey, though it did also apply to other spirits as well. In order to carry the words bottled in bond or bonded on a whiskey label, that whiskey had to be distilled at a single distillery during a single distilling season. We're all familiar with the 4 seasons, spring, summer, fall, and winter, but there are only 2 recognized distilling seasons. The spring season runs from New Year's Day through the last day of June, while the fall season runs from July 1st through December 31st. The whiskey also has to be matured for at least 4 years in a federally bonded warehouse and bottled at a minimum of 50% ABV or 100 proof. And finally, the label has to name the specific distillery where that whiskey was made. These days, you'll usually see it identified as DSP with a number behind it. That's the distilled spirits plant permit for the actual distillery. And in addition to the quality control aspect, there was another reason for distillers to support the Bottled in Bond Act. It allowed them to defer paying taxes on their maturing whiskey until it was removed from the bonded warehouse for bottling. For many years, Treasury agents were assigned to oversee bonded warehouses, just like the excisemen in Scotland who used to live at the distilleries. Now, the reason it's called a bonded warehouse, then, just as now, a distiller has to post a bond with the federal government to make sure that the taxes eventually get paid when a barrel of whiskey is removed from that warehouse covered by the bond. If you have something you'd like us to dig into for Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. That's also where you'll find links for the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast. It's brought to you by the Whiskey Exchange. And our WhiskyCast HD videos are available there too, along with the latest whiskey news, events, my tasting notes, photos, and a whole lot more including a complete archive of our past episodes. You may have noticed some of the changes that we've made to WhiskyCast over the last few weeks, and would love to get your thoughts. Let us know what you think on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Tumblr at WhiskyCast, or email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is Whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch whisky, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you twice each week from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.